Natalie adjusted her glasses and let out a slow breath, her eyes scanning the sleek, modern office she had worked so hard to build a career in. She was a senior architect at one of the most prestigious firms in the city, a position she had earned through years of relentless effort. Yet, at that moment, the accomplishment felt distant, overshadowed by the familiar weight of family responsibility pressing down on her. The phone in her hand buzzed again. A call from her mother, Vivian. Natalie already knew what the conversation would be about before she even answered. "You're really abandoning your family, Natalie," Vivian's voice thundered through the speaker the moment she picked up, the accusation laced with disappointment. The guilt trip had begun. Natalie pinched the bridge of her nose, already feeling the tension settle into her shoulders. "Mom, I've explained this before. I can't keep bailing Jake out. He's 30 years old. He needs to take responsibility for himself." Vivian scoffed. "He's your brother. Family is supposed to help each other." Help. The word made Natalie's stomach twist. How many times had she helped Jake in the past? Too many to count. Ever since their father passed away when she was 12, she had stepped into the role of the responsible one, while Jake had always been given the benefit of the doubt. He had been coddled, excused from every mistake, shielded from every consequence. Now, as an adult, he still lived as though life would magically sort itself out for him. His dream of becoming a musician had turned into an excuse for endless financial irresponsibility. He worked a few small gigs here and there, but most of his money went straight to expensive recording equipment, nights out, and vacations he couldn't afford. Meanwhile, Natalie had been the one who sacrificed. She had studied late into the night to earn a scholarship. She had worked internships while juggling classes. She had climbed the corporate ladder with sheer determination. And yet, despite all that, her success was seen as a reason to give more, to shoulder more, to fix what Jake broke. This time, though, she refused. "Mom," she said, keeping her voice as steady as possible, "I've covered his rent before. I paid off his credit card debt once. I even helped with his car repairs when he said he needed to get back on his feet. And every time, he just finds a new way to dig himself into a hole." "You're being selfish," Vivian snapped. "He just needs a little help. That's what family does." Natalie exhaled sharply, gripping the phone tighter. There it was, the same argument, over and over again. It didn't matter that she had paid for Jake's mistakes, more times than she could count. It didn't matter that she had worked twice as hard just to stay afloat, while he coasted through life. The only thing that mattered to Vivian was that Natalie could help, so she should help. But this time she wouldn't. "I'm not doing it," Natalie said firmly. "I'm done." The silence on the other end was heavy, filled with unspoken resentment. Then, with an angry huff, Vivian muttered, "I hope you can live with yourself," before hanging up. Natalie sat back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The guilt should have eaten away at her like it always did, but instead, there was something new, a quiet, unfamiliar sense of relief. For the first time in years, she had said no. Little did she know, that single refusal would set off a chain of events that would change everything, exposing betrayals far greater than she could have ever imagined. The next morning, Natalie's phone buzzed incessantly as she sat at her kitchen counter, sipping her first cup of coffee. She groggily reached for it, expecting a work email or a client message. Instead, what she saw made her stomach drop. Her mother had posted a long, dramatic rant on Facebook. Family should always come first, but sadly, not everyone believes that. Some people would rather turn their back on their own blood than lift a finger to help. It's heartbreaking when greed wins over love and loyalty. I'm truly disappointed. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Natalie's hands tightened around her mug as she read through the flood of comments beneath the post. Old family friends, distant relatives, even people she barely remembered from childhood were sympathizing with Vivian, completely buying into her twisted narrative. So sorry you're going through this, Vivian. Some people forget where they came from once they find success. Disgusting. Money changes people, and not for the better. I can't believe Natalie would do this. Jake has always been such a kind soul. He doesn't deserve this. Natalie felt her heartbeat quicken, a mix of anger and betrayal bubbling under the surface. The people commenting didn't know the full story. They didn't know about the thousands of dollars she had given Jake over the years, the endless second chances, the way she had been treated like an ATM rather than a sister. And then she saw Jake's post. I never thought my own sister would leave me out in the cold, but I guess money means more to her than family. At least I know who really has my back. Thanks, Mom. A wave of pure rage shot through her. He had turned this into a public spectacle, painting himself as the helpless victim while completely ignoring the reality of his choices. He had wasted his money on expensive studio sessions, nights out, and luxury gadgets. And yet now he was acting as if Natalie had abandoned him to suffer on the streets. Her notifications kept piling up. Texts from coworkers, concern messages from close friends, and even a few emails from extended family members telling her to reconsider. Natalie, this is getting out of hand. Maybe you should just help Jake one last time, for Mom's sake, one message read. I don't know what's going on, but you should probably address it. People are starting to talk, another coworker texted. Her face burned. This wasn't just about family drama anymore. It was affecting her reputation, her career, and her peace of mind. For a brief moment, she considered responding. Should she write her own post? Should she defend herself, listing every dollar she had spent on Jake, every sacrifice she had made? But then she stopped herself. No. Jake and Vivian wanted her to react, to be dragged into their emotional battlefield, to play their game so they could keep twisting the story. If she responded in anger, they'd only use it against her. Instead, she did something she had never done before. She documented everything. Screenshots of the Facebook posts. Records of every transaction she had covered for Jake. Old text messages where Vivian had pressured her to send money. Then she made a decision. This wasn't just about hurt feelings anymore. This was defamation. And she knew exactly who to call. Natalie stared at her laptop screen, the harsh glow illuminating the growing file of evidence she had compiled. Screenshots of Facebook posts, bank statements showing the countless times she had covered Jake's expenses, and old text messages where Vivian had guilt-tripped her into handing over money. The more she scrolled through the files, the more her anger solidified into determination. This wasn't just a petty online feud anymore. This was character assassination. Without a second thought, she grabbed her phone and dialed Ethan Carter, a well-regarded corporate attorney specializing in financial fraud and defamation cases. They had met years ago at a networking event, and while they had never worked together before, Natalie knew he was sharp, meticulous, and exactly the person she needed on her side. Ethan, I need your help, she said the moment he answered. Good to hear from you, Natalie, he replied, his tone friendly but professional. What's going on? Natalie took a deep breath and launched into the full story. Her refusal to cover Jake's rent, the Facebook posts that followed, the wave of public backlash, and the damage to her personal and professional reputation. When she finished, Ethan was quiet for a moment, then said, Defamation cases can be tricky, but if these posts are affecting your career or emotional well-being, we have something to work with. Have you experienced any professional setbacks because of this? Natalie hesitated. Not yet, but I work with a lot of high-profile clients. If this gossip spreads further, it could absolutely harm my reputation. That's enough to build a case, Ethan assured her. But let's start by gathering everything. I'll need every screenshot, every text, every transaction where you covered for your brother. This isn't just about clearing your name, it's about setting a precedent that they can't treat you like this anymore." Natalie nodded, feeling a flicker of relief that someone was finally on her side. "I'll send everything over tonight." As she hung up, another thought crept into her mind, one that made her chest tighten with unease. What about her inheritance? Her father had left money for both her and Jake when he passed away, but their mother, as the trustee, had managed it until they each turned 25. Natalie had always assumed her portion had been sitting untouched in an account somewhere, waiting for her if she ever needed it. But now, she wasn't so sure. On impulse, she texted Ethan again. "While we're at it, can you look into my inheritance? I just want to make sure everything is in order." Ethan's response was almost immediate. "Of course. I'll start digging into it tomorrow." Natalie closed her laptop, exhaling shakily. She had reached her breaking point, and there was no turning back now. What she didn't know yet was that her fight for justice was only beginning. A week later, Natalie sat at her desk, sipping her morning coffee, when she noticed a new email from Ethan. The subject line sent a chill down her spine. "Inheritance investigation findings." Her fingers trembled as she clicked on the message, her heart hammering in her chest. She scanned the document, her eyes darting over figures and transactions that made no sense. The inheritance account, her inheritance account, was supposed to have remained untouched until she turned 25. Yet, according to the records Ethan had uncovered, someone had been withdrawing money from it for years. Her stomach lurched as she read further. The culprit was Jake. Natalie's hands clenched into fists. Thousands of dollars were missing. Money she had never even known she had, stolen right from under her nose. The withdrawals had started 5 years ago, small at first, then increasing in size. The pattern was clear. Whenever Jake needed money, he dipped into her inheritance to fund his lifestyle. Natalie's jaw tightened as she saw exactly where the money had gone. The records listed transactions that made her blood boil. Expensive recording equipment, high-end studio rentals, 5-star vacations, designer clothes, concert tickets. While she had been working long hours, sacrificing her personal life, and carefully managing her finances, Jake had been living extravagantly, on her dime. For a moment, she sat frozen in place, unable to process the full scope of the betrayal. Taking a shaky breath, she called Ethan immediately. He picked up on the second ring. "Tell me everything," she demanded, her voice sharp with barely controlled anger. Ethan sighed. "It's worse than I initially thought. The account was under your mother's management until you turned 25. But after that, Jake somehow gained access. We're still figuring out how, but either Vivian knowingly gave him control or he found a way to take it without her knowing. Either way, he's been draining your inheritance for years." Natalie gritted her teeth, fury and disbelief churning inside her. How could this even happen? My mother was supposed to protect that money. Ethan hesitated. It's possible she trusted Jake to manage it responsibly, but given everything else we know, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that she was complicit. The words sent a fresh wave of rage through Natalie. Had her mother, the same woman who accused her of being selfish, allowed this to happen? Had she known the entire time and just expected Natalie to stay quiet? "You have clear grounds for legal action," Ethan continued. "This is financial fraud. It doesn't matter whether your mother knew or not. Jake stole from you. If we move forward with a case, we can force him to return the money, and depending on how this plays out, we might have to go after Vivian as well." Natalie closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. Her mother had guilt-tripped her for refusing to give Jake money, all while he was stealing from her behind her back. The sheer hypocrisy of it all, made her head spin. For years, she had allowed herself to believe that being the responsible one meant sacrificing for family. That if she just worked harder, earned more, stayed kind and understanding, things would eventually balance out. But that had been a lie. Jake had taken from her without remorse. Vivian had either ignored it or actively allowed it to happen. And neither of them had any intention of ever telling her the truth. Natalie took a deep breath, forcing herself to push aside the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "File the case," she said, her voice cold and unwavering. Ethan paused. "Are you sure? Once we take this to court, there's no turning back." Natalie opened the bank records again, staring at each stolen dollar, each moment of betrayal etched into financial history. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she said. This wasn't just about getting her money back. This was about finally standing up for herself and making them face the consequence. That evening, Natalie sat at her kitchen table, phone in hand, staring at the screen. Her fingers hovered over her mother's contact, hesitation flickering through her mind. She wasn't sure what angered her more, the fact that Jake had stolen from her, or the possibility that Vivian had let it happen. Either way, she deserved answers. With a deep breath, she tapped the call button. Vivian answered almost immediately. "Natalie," she said, her tone still carrying the familiar edge of irritation. "I hope you're finally ready to talk some sense into yourself. You know, Jake is really hurt by all of this." "Save it!" Natalie cut her off, her voice sharp and steady. "I didn't call to argue about Jake. I called because I know the truth." There was a brief silence. "The truth?" Vivian echoed cautiously. "Yes," Natalie said, gripping the phone tighter. "I had a lawyer investigate Dad's inheritance. Turns out Jake's been stealing from me for the past 5 years. Thousands of dollars, gone. And the only way that could have happened is if he had access. So tell me, Mom, did you give it to him? Did you let him take my money?" Vivian's response came slower this time, her usual assertiveness suddenly faltering. "It's not what you think," she said quietly. "Then explain," Natalie snapped. "Because it sure looks like you let Jake drain my inheritance while you were busy calling me selfish." A long pause. Then, finally, a sigh. "He needed help, Natalie," Vivian admitted. "He was struggling, and I thought you'd be okay without it." Natalie let out a bitter laugh, disbelief crashing over her like a wave. "You thought I'd be okay without it? That money wasn't yours to give away, Mom. It was mine. And instead of telling me, instead of asking me, you let Jake rob me blind while you stood there defending him." "I thought he'd pay it back," Vivian's voice cracked, frustration creeping in. "He promised me he would, and You trusted him," Natalie finished coldly. "Just like you always do. And where did that get you? Because he didn't just steal from me, Mom. He stole from you too." Silence. Natalie exhaled slowly. "That's right," she continued. "I had my lawyer dig deeper. Jake's been using your retirement savings the same way he's been using my inheritance. He's taken money from you, just like he did to me. And I bet he didn't tell you about that, did he?" A sharp inhale from Vivian's end of the line. "That's not possible," she whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice, only fear. Natalie felt a pang of something. Was it sympathy? Maybe, but it was buried beneath years of frustration. "I sent the documents to my lawyer," she said, her voice firm. "We're filing the case. Against Jake, for fraud, and against both of you, for defamation." Vivian's breath hitched. You're really going to sue your own family?" Natalie's grip on the phone tightened. "I trusted my own family," she said, her voice laced with years of hurt. "And look where that got me." Vivian didn't respond. For the first time, she had nothing to say. Natalie didn't wait for an apology. She knew better by now. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," she said, before ending the call. As she placed the phone down, a wave of clarity washed over her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving her family's manipulation. She was fighting back. The next morning, Natalie sat across from Ethan in his sleek downtown office, watching as he meticulously organized the legal documents in front of him. The gravity of the situation settled in as she saw her own name on the official complaint forms. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. This was real. She was taking legal action against her own family. Ethan glanced up, his expression calm but firm. "We have 2 cases to pursue," he explained. "First, the defamation lawsuit. Your mother and Jake's social media posts were clearly damaging, and we can argue that they negatively impacted both your professional and personal reputation. Second, the financial fraud case. The evidence we've gathered is solid: bank records, unauthorized withdrawals, and your mother's admission that she allowed Jake to access the inheritance. If we move forward with both, things are going to get messy." "Messy doesn't bother me anymore," Natalie said, crossing her arms. "I just want this handled. I want them to understand that I'm done being their safety net." Ethan nodded, sliding a pen across the table. "Then let's start with the formal filings. Once we submit these, your mother and Jake will be officially served." Natalie took the pen and signed her name with a steady hand. For the first time in years, she wasn't backing down. Hours later, as she sat in her apartment, her phone lit up with a flood of missed calls and frantic messages from her mother. Vivian had received the legal notice. "Natalie, please, we don't have to do this," one voicemail pleaded. "Jake didn't mean to hurt you. Can't we just talk this through as a family?" But Natalie knew better. They didn't want to fix things. They wanted to avoid consequences. Then, as she scrolled through her notifications, she saw Jake's latest Facebook post. "First, she refuses to help me. Now she's suing her own family over money? Greedy, selfish, and heartless. Some people really show their true colors when cash is involved." Natalie took a deep breath. This time, she didn't feel guilt. This time, she took a screenshot and sent it straight to Ethan. "Add this to the case file," she texted. No more second chances. No more playing the villain in their twisted story. They wanted a war. Now, they had one. The day of the hearing arrived faster than Natalie expected, and as she walked into the courtroom, a wave of emotions washed over her: anticipation, determination, and a hint of unease. She wasn't afraid of the truth coming out, but she knew this moment would permanently redefine her relationship with her family. Seated across from her was Jake, leaning back in his chair with a smirk, acting as if the entire thing was a mild inconvenience. His arrogance made her blood boil. Beside him, their mother, Vivian, looked far less composed. Her shoulders slumped, her fingers twisted anxiously in her lap. Ethan sat beside Natalie, calm and focused as he organized their documents. When the judge entered, the room hushed and the proceedings began. The defamation case was addressed first, with Ethan methodically presenting screenshots of Jake and Vivian's Facebook posts, messages from colleagues expressing concern over Natalie's reputation, and a timeline proving how the public accusations had affected her personally and professionally. Jake rolled his eyes when called to the stand. "I didn't mean for things to go this far," he said, voice dripping with faux remorse. "I was just upset. Family should help each other, and I felt abandoned." He glanced toward the judge, hoping to gain sympathy. "I never thought my sister would drag me into court over a few posts." Ethan didn't let it slide. "So, you're saying you regret making those statements?" Jake nodded quickly. "Yeah, of course." "Then why," Ethan continued smoothly, holding up a fresh screenshot, "did you post this just 3 days ago?" Natalie's stomach clenched as she saw the printout. Jake's latest smear post, calling her greedy, selfish, and heartless. Gasps rippled through the small courtroom as the judge's expression darkened. Jake's face paled, caught in his own lie. The defamation case was looking like an easy win, but then came the bigger battle, the financial fraud case. Ethan presented the bank records showing how Jake had drained Natalie's inheritance over 5 years, using the funds for luxury purchases instead of necessities. Then came the unexpected twist. "Before we proceed further," Ethan said, turning to the judge, "I'd like to introduce additional financial records regarding fraudulent withdrawals from a second account." Natalie's breath caught. "A second account?" Ethan handed over a new file. "My investigation uncovered that Jake wasn't just stealing from Natalie. He was also withdrawing funds from their mother's personal retirement savings." A stunned silence filled the courtroom. Natalie's eyes darted to Vivian. Her face went white, her lips parted in shock. Jake froze, his usual cocky demeanor completely shattered. "That's not true," he blurted, but it was too late. The evidence was there in black and white, transactions traced directly to his accounts. Vivian stared at her son in horror. "Jake," she whispered, realizing for the first time that he had betrayed her too. The judge took a deep breath, glancing between them all. "Given this new information, we need to assess both cases separately, but based on the evidence presented today, I see clear grounds for financial misconduct." Natalie sat back in her chair, watching as the weight of reality finally crashed down on her mother and brother. For the first time, Jake had to face the consequences of his actions. And for the first time, Vivian saw the son she had defended for years for who he truly was. The court ruling had been decisive. Natalie had won both cases. Jake was ordered to repay the stolen inheritance, though she knew it would take years before she saw most of the money. The defamation lawsuit resulted in a court-mandated public apology, forcing both Jake and Vivian to retract their statements online. While the financial victory was satisfying, what struck Natalie the most was the shift in her mother's demeanor. Vivian, who had once defended Jake at all costs, now looked defeated, broken by the realization that her son had not only betrayed his sister, but had stolen from her as well. She reached out to Natalie after the trial, her voice hesitant. I don't know how to fix this," she admitted over the phone. "I trusted him, and I was wrong." Natalie sighed, running a hand through her hair. She had spent years seeking validation from her mother, waiting for her to finally see the truth. But now that it had happened, she wasn't sure what to do with it. The damage had been done. "You start by being honest," Natalie said simply. "With yourself, with me, and stop making excuses for Jake." Vivian didn't argue. For the first time, she just listened. As for Jake, he had gone completely silent. His once arrogant smirk had disappeared in the courtroom, and Natalie knew that whatever sense of entitlement he had carried for years had finally collapsed under the weight of reality. Whether or not he changed was up to him, but she was done waiting for that day to come. In the weeks that followed, Natalie felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The calls demanding money had stopped, the family guilt trips had faded. She was no longer the fixer, the ATM, or the one holding everything together. One evening, as she sat on her apartment balcony, sipping tea and watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, she realized something profound. She had spent her whole life believing that setting boundaries would mean losing everything. But instead, it had given her everything she had been searching for: freedom, respect, and most importantly, self-worth. Months had passed since the courtroom battle, and life had settled into a quiet, steady rhythm, one that finally belonged to Natalie. There were no more frantic calls from her mother, No more manipulative pleas for money, and no more public shaming. The silence that once would have unnerved her now felt like peace. Her mother still reached out occasionally, but the conversations were different now. They weren't filled with guilt trips or expectations, just simple updates about her garden, a new book she was reading, or how she had started budgeting her finances properly for the first time in years. The wounds between them weren't fully healed, but for the first time, there was honesty instead of manipulation. Jake, however, remained completely absent from her life. His court-ordered payments came in sporadically, but Natalie didn't depend on them. She had long since stopped waiting for an apology. Whether he regretted his actions or not was no longer her concern. As she sat on her balcony one evening, sipping tea and gazing at the skyline, she thought back to the girl she had been, the one who sacrificed, compromised, and gave until there was nothing left. That girl was gone now. In her place stood a woman who knew her worth, who no longer let guilt define her choices. She had spent years chasing acceptance from the wrong people. Now she had found something far more valuable: herself. The greatest lesson from Natalie's story is the importance of setting boundaries and valuing self-respect over forced family obligations. For years she allowed guilt and manipulation to dictate her actions, constantly sacrificing her own well-being for the sake of her brother and mother. But when she finally stood up for herself, she realized that protecting her own peace wasn't selfish, it was necessary. The story highlights how blind loyalty can be dangerous. Natalie's mother excused Jake's behavior for years, believing that family should always help each other. However, that belief enabled Jake's entitlement and led to betrayal. Unconditional support without accountability only leads to abuse of trust. Another key takeaway is that people show their true colors when faced with consequences. Vivian, when confronted with the truth, began to take responsibility, but Jake, even when caught, refused to acknowledge his wrongdoing. Natalie learned that she couldn't control others' actions, but she could control how much she allowed them to affect her life. Ultimately, Natalie's journey teaches us that family should be built on mutual respect, not obligation. Standing up for yourself may come with loss, but in the end, it brings something far greater: freedom and self-worth.